Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. No mai haere mai, and welcome to the Nelson Arts Festival's live stream session, Once Were Hippies, featuring Miro Bilbrough in conversation with Steve Braunias. Ko Kerry Sunderland toka whenua. My name is Kerry Sunderland, and I'm the coordinator of Pukapuka Talks, the Nelson Arts Festival's literary program. I was born and raised on Bunurong country in Victoria, and have lived in Te Tauihu, the top of the South Island of New Zealand, Aotearoa, since late 2012. I acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of all these lands and pay my respect to elders past, present and future. I'm presently sitting in Whakatu Nelson at our lovely venue, the Theatre Royal, where we've set up a pop-up studio to beam this broadcast to you out to the world today. The whole Nelson Arts Festival team is committed to ensuring this session is as inclusive as possible. So joining us today are two sign language interpreters, Kelly and Fran from Platform Interpreting. You'll see one of them at a time, not both. For those of you listening rather than watching today, I'm an Australian woman with long brown wavy hair and black rimmed glasses. I'm wearing a purple top and I'm sitting in front of a green banner with the Nelson Arts Festival logo in the top corner. I use the pronouns she and her. Before I introduce the two authors who will kōrero today, I'd also like to quickly cover a few housekeeping things. If you're watching this session live, that is from 11 till 12 on Monday morning, October 25th, we will be welcoming your questions towards the end of the session. So you could, if you think of a question, jot it down, or if you like, you can submit it straight away through the chat window on YouTube. And make sure you get your questions up there before about 11:45. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the chair of today's session, Steve Braunias, who lives and works in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Steve is a columnist, journalist, editor, and author of 11 books. His latest book is a true crime collection, Missing Persons. He currently edits Newsroom's book section, Reading Room, and Steve reviewed in the Time of the Manaroans on Reading Room last year, calling it the best written book of non-fiction of 2020. So now it's time for me to disappear off stage, and through the marvels of technology, I see they're already appearing. Please welcome Steve and Miro. Over to you, Steve.
Hello there. My name is Steve Braunias. I speak to you from my home in Te Atatu in West Auckland. I am a man in the winter of my years, and I'm wearing a powder blue shirt which matches my eyes. And I am speaking with the extraordinary Miro Bilbrough. Miro has always been a woman of considerable beauty. She speaks to us from her home in Dulwich, I believe it is called, in Sydney. Her hair is neither white nor grey, it is silver. And we are going to be talking about her book, In the Time of the Manaroans, which was published by Victoria University Press in 2020. In my role as editor of the book section Reading Room on the news site Newsroom, I named it the best book of non-fiction published in New Zealand last year. And in Australia, it was shortlisted for a major prize, the New South Wales Premier Award. It is a memoir in the classical sense. It is not an autobiography. It is not the story of her life. It focuses very intently on a small period, possibly around about 2 to 3 years, around about 1979 to 1981. And the setting is the book, really. The setting is in a very small settlement, a kind of commune in the Marlborough Sounds. And this is where Miro went to stay with her father at the age of around about 16, 17. So there's a little bit of before in the book about her childhood. And there's a little bit after in the book as a young woman in Wellington. And this is where Miro and I actually met and another extraordinary location, the Lotus Yoga Centre inner city commune in Wellington's Arrow Street. Someone probably ought to write a memoir about that place, but it was not as extraordinary or vivid a place, really, as the commune that Miro describes and writes about with fantastic insight and wonderful understanding and sympathy and empathy too in her book. Miro will begin the session by giving a reading from her book. So Miro, if I may ask you to begin, please.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for that lovely introduction. And hello, everybody. It's great to be here. Steve's just given a great setup, really, so I don't have to say much before I read. Just to say that I was 14 when I went to live with my dad, and I'm just going to read you a little bit about that house we lived in Canvastown. I'd lived with my grandmother from 7, and I had 3 days' notice. Sort of was ousted, really, to be frank. And this is a description of where we all lived together. My sister, my father was a newly solo dad. Well, he was actually just newly kind of single. And then my sister arrived, and within three or 4 weeks, I arrived. So suddenly he was a solo dad. It's kind of a shock to us all. This is called Weather Event. The locals call our house the Hippie house, which strikes me as inept and an accurate code for goings on, for orgies and bong haze and other phenomena that some in the Wakamarina Valley clearly perceive their lives to be lacking in, deficient in. They have no idea how lacking our household is in the most basic stimulants: television, Coca-Cola, instant coffee, white sugar, let alone opportunistic sex parties. Don't they realize my father is a Puritan? Pooling our isolation in the wooden house propped unsteadily on 5 o'clock shadow lawn, abstaining from mainstream entertainments. It is just the 3 of us alone together again. Then an explosion of hooves around the bend in the valley road. The Manaroans come to break their journey north or south at my father's. They arrive by collective noun, by horse-drawn hoop and canvas wagon, as if directly out of a Western or Eastern European saga, by power of thumb in 1s or 2s, or solitary by steed. But however the Manaroans arrive, the air is charged as it is right before an extreme weather event, a weather event inside and outside my head. And I just want to go on a little bit, because this book is really largely a book of my father's world, with a sort of self-portrait running under Manaroans. The great beauty, dressed in a dirty, earth-coloured calico dress that emphasises her fertility goddess figure, Claire has fox-sharp features and a prominent beauty spot on her cheek. At 21, she is younger by 6 or 7 years than the average Manaroan. Regardless, the commune survival turns on this formidable character. On her occasional visits to my father's house, Claire doesn't say much. Rather, she pulls on a rolly, drinks strong tea out of a blue-lit enamel mug, chops firewood as well as any man, neglects her beauty in a way that is commanding, and watches whatever there is to go down, go down. Sometimes she chews the end of her thumb, a rare reminder of youth. Nail biter, she confesses, blushing to the root when she catches me watching. Claire quit school as a teenager, not long after she became the garden founder of the Manaroa commune. Now she works like a pioneer and smokes like a narrow-eyed cowboy. The New Zealand light is strong. Everyone is a little afraid of her. Manaroan's bountiful kitchen garden is legendary. I hear of it long before I clap eyes. Its great horticultural beauty is mostly down to Claire and those who tread her green-sprung footsteps, Kate, Sylvie, Bernadette. The garden is given over to herbs, giant rows of salad food and companion plants, frilly kale decades before it has entered urban hipster consciousness, purple-skinned garlic, the dark-veined beet leaves that make the contents of our salad bowls pithy, marigold and borage flowers for bug repelling and for eating, and here and there a lemon or tamarillo tree. This does not come close to describing the garden's unmarshaled abundance nor its flowers, for it is in the Manaroa garden that I discover those idiosyncratic flowers that resemble two-tone jester hats, aquilesias, or as Kate, herself as leggy and astringent as a spring onion, informs me, columbine after Harlequin's sweetheart, aquilesia. The word is at least half the attraction. Love in a mist with whiskery fronds that screen and frame a single star-shaped blue flower is another literary siren with an ingenious face. From this time on, I cultivate these mercurial flowers and they me. Kate arrives at the flood house in the company of Claire, one loquacious, the other steadfastly reluctant to be drawn. Everything about them, from their muddy work boots beneath ragged hems to their labor-dented limbs, spells can do. Kate is directly acquainted with the second wave of American feminism. It might have been she who inspired my father to mail Our Bodies, Ourselves, with its black and white shots of self-empowering pocket mirror held to labia for my 14th birthday, secret images right out there in the open that burn a hole in my mind. In fact, my father has an affinity for the women's movement that predates his acquaintance with Kate. This alliance is not disinterested. Ever since he was born and thus subjected to the iron law of his headmaster father, my father has found men and their delusion of entitlement and expertise an intolerable bore. Decades before mansplaining is coined, in another century, in one or other of the departure lounges that crisscross my childhood, my father fills the time before takeoff by pointing out a male stranger, gratuitously explaining something to a long-suffering woman over airport coffee.
That was fantastic. It's really fantastic. It's so observant. One wonders how you remember these things, and one supposes that you were observing them at the time. Among other things, it's a wonderful portrait of that place and a wonderful portrait of your dad. If I can ask about the place first, Manaroa. You describe it in that passage which you've read. You're evoking something quite Arcadian, very beautiful, quite innocent and untroubled. However, elsewhere in the book, you write very insightfully about what you describe as complex hippie codes of behavior. And in many ways, it was a kind of a social laboratory. I think from reading this, that there was a heck of a lot going on, and people were there for their own different reasons, some escaping, some trying to find stuff. And to function as a society, certain sacrifices and compromises had to be made. Individuality almost seems subsumed, though, by this need to cooperate and to exist as a commune. Here comes my cat coming into the frame, unfortunately. I'd like to ask you more about these complex hippie codes. And for a start, hippie is not quite the right word, is it, for this group of people? What would be a better way of describing them than as hippies?
Well, hello, cat. Beautiful long-haired cat, Persian cat.
A ragdoll.
A ragdoll. That's a kind. I didn't come up with a better word in the book. I sort of pick on the word because I don't really remember that we referred to ourselves as such. And the word hippies had a very California, San Fran vibe, and San Francisco, Haight-Ashbury, and none of that really resonated. I think I mentioned in that reading that it felt more like a sort of an Eastern European gypsy saga, and certainly like temperament and aesthetic felt more aligned to that than the American sort of incarnation of the counterculture. So, I mean, there was Back to the Landers was around, but that's a real mouthful. No one would ever say, oh, I'm a Back to the Lander. But I think that we were a bit untroubled by categorization. It was for others, categorization is usually for someone outside the group, wanting to diss the group or isolate the group or name the group. So we didn't really need a term. And then there's the problem, I think, that although you said, individuality was subsumed, certainly occasionally it was, but most days we didn't manage that. And it really, really was a sort of bunch of rugged individuals. It wasn't, in fact, it was a bunch of non-joiners. I almost think that was the premise of the commune, that everyone was a non-joiner. And I seem to have, I think I grew up in a family of non-joiners. And so I've merrily continued my whole life to hang out with non-joiners. And the Manaroans were really like that. There weren't.
I think you were lucky. I think you were lucky there in some ways in Manaroa to be in a particular commune. Manaroa didn't seem afflicted with any kind of ideology. And here I am thinking of a contemporary commune, centre point, which of course was ideologically damned.
Well, it was anti-ideology, and sometimes people would come through, the Orange people, the Rajneesh, and they were sort of slightly bemusedly tolerated and welcomed. I think tolerated is a bit mean, sort of welcomed, but not subscribed to. It really was very anti-ideological. There were a couple of rules, and that was no drug dealers, so there was no money to be made from that. Was that was considered unethical, and no welfare, which was pretty tough actually, because we were a long way from work, and there were solo parents. But that was so. It was a sort of austerity as well in some ways. Codes.
I referred before that it's a really wonderful portrait of your father. Your father being Miro Bilbrough, who's a short story writer in New Zealand of rare and singular talent with such a lovely, gentle touch. And the portrait that you write of Norman in this book, he does sort of strike me as somebody who seems to be in flight from the deranged New Zealand masculinity. Do you think that's true?
Yes, I mean, I think that he sort of practiced that early at his father's table, because his father was, very, he was a sort of institutional man, and he was a rules man. And my father, he was didactic. He was a headmaster, so he was an authority, particularly authoritarian one. And my father was sort of the opposite of all of those things, and kind of refused to please his own father in the scholarly ways, even though he was very capable in that realm. I think it sort of set him on a contrarian path, because he was dodging his father's scrutiny. I mention in the book, in fact, the opening sort of scene is his the occasional job clipping, falling out of his bedside book stacks when I go to live with him, and he's, I'm 15 and he's in his early 30s, because his dad is still sending him job clippings, for English teacher applications that he will never apply for. So there's still this kind of tug of war going on about who he might be and how he should live his life. So I think he was set up really, really early with that male notion of sort of expertise, and he was it didn't suit him in any way in his sensibility and his proclivities. Yeah. So it was an unusual father to grow up with it in that sense. Yeah, that
you two are very close though, aren't you? You don't have a troubled, difficult relationship that Norman had with his father. You two you've always seemed very close to me.
Well, I only lived with my dad till I was 7, and we were close. I think we sort of had a real affinity. And then, of course, I didn't live with him till I was 14. So I really idealized him because he was this distant figure. And he always seemed like a lot of fun. And I had a lot of empathy for him because he was also always tired. And he was imaginative. And then when I went to live with him at 14, he was incredibly respectful towards me. So it was almost as if we were contemporaries. And I can remember hitchhiking, between Nelson and Canvastown, and occasionally people thought we were brother and sister, which weirdly I found quite flattering. I mean, that sort of stuff wore off after a while, that sort of idealization, I think. It really took to my sort of mid-40s for me to have any bumps with it, which is pretty extraordinary. Yeah.
There seems to be like an absence of rigid roles here. It's not your typical, very defined father-daughter relationship, and indeed neither is there a typical and defined mother-daughter relationship with your mother, the great artist Christina Conrad. She's largely an absent figure in this memoir.
Well, she was off screen, but I left my parents at 7 and I went to live with her mother's mother, and I saw them a handful of times, and they were these incredibly exotic beatniks. I think I might even have known they were beatniks, who visited and sort of, I think I seem to remember she had a leather mini skirt, and I mean, they were just so glamorous. So I pined for them a bit, but they were sort of exotic strangers. And for a long time, I was very cozy at my grandmother's. So I did have that parenting. But, by the time I went to live with my father at 14, my father had just separated from my mother, and it was pretty raw sort of. She lived at the top of the valley and he lived at the bottom of the valley. And I only saw her a couple of times. And likewise, I mean, I think I sort of record each time I saw her in the memoir because they were so few. There was a very strange moment when I was about 10 and at Kelburn Normal School in Wellington, and we went on a camping trip to Blenheim, and we went to go panning for gold in Canvastown, and we got off the school tour bus. And there were my parents at the general store. It really was, there was a pub and a general, it was sort of a one-horse town and a river. And there they were. And that, that really took my breath away. That was strange and sort of terrible to see your parents with the babe in arms and have this sort of polite conversation, and then go off to do gold panning. That was pretty strange. Yeah, that was sad.
Are you describing in some ways a sense of shame?
No, at that point, no, I think that I thought they were pretty wonderful looking. I mean, there were moments, I do remember that my mother went through a phase, she used to wear a feather in her hair. So it was her sort of, she called them Red Indians in those days, but her native Indian phase. And she was sometimes mistaken for one, and she would wear this feather in her hair down Upland Road in Kelburn, which was pretty straight. And I would, walk sort of 10 paces behind because that was embarrassing. I was old enough to be embarrassed. But at that stage, no, I don't think it was shame. I think it was just this guttering awareness of blood relation and unfamiliarity. So it's just sort of really strange. It was dissonant, it was emotionally dissonant, and it was just sad. Yeah, it was such a polite conversation we had. Who wants to have a polite conversation with their parents?
It's obviously something which is deeply felt, these episode in your life at Manaroa and your relationship with your mum and dad in that context. Because in some ways, this book is a continuation of a project that you created several years before. Miro is a filmmaker. I've seen your film Floodhouse, which is, I think, a 60, 70-minute movie, and it's kind of like the film of the book that came much later. It's a really beautiful film. I think it's absolutely wonderful and magical. The characters, or actors rather, who portray your parents do it very sensitively. And indeed, I'm remembering the woman who played your mother does indeed have a feather in her hair and looks like a very kind of terrifying, primitive, somebody possibly in possession of genius, because your mother is a terrific artist, a great artist.
Absolutely, yeah.
But the fact that you made this movie and then several years later you wrote this book, these years, I mean, it's not just material, is it? I don't think, Miro. This is something which you felt deeply and have been wanting to explore in different ways. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, they do sort of say, and I always take these things with a grain of salt, but that, that you have one story, and I don't know how I feel about those tenets, but I think perhaps, and I was talking about this with Charlotte Grimshaw the other day, that I tried the fictionalization version. I tried the fictional version of Floodhouse. I think I was, I knew that it was a very cinematic world. The river flooded inside the Floodhouse 4 feet, and it was a sort of a kind of a primal scene in all senses. So I knew that it had that quality of almost through the looking glass kind of world that you could travel into. And that's the kind of movie I love. So that was really attractive to me, but I think I needed to recreate it. And in some way I needed to recreate those characters because I hadn't met their ilk before or again. And there was a character who's in the book called John of Saratoga, who I renamed Herringbone John when I fictionalized him because he used to wear broken down Sally Army coats. So there was this kind of wanting to hold the world and wanting to share it and wanting to recreate it. And it wasn't going to be a doco, it was a story. So I made the film and it seemed to work as a film, I think, because it had this story world. And I had to fictionalize it. It was good. It was good. I feel like it's the truest film I've made, but I don't mean the most non-fictional. I just mean the truest, in that the actors got the characters right. It was just this lovely alchemy that happened, that sometimes happens when you collaborate and other times not quite. But I didn't know that I hadn't finished with it. And it wasn't until, I think, 2016, and I was coming out of a doctorate, and I'd been sort of apprenticeship to that scholarly academic language, which didn't really suit me. And I came out of it and I said pretty rawly to my partner, I'm not going to be anybody's bitch anymore. I was really sort of quite hurting from the containment, really. And I sat down and I didn't know I was going to write this book. I started writing about my father's messy room, and then bang, I'd written 10,000 words in a week, and it was just sort of waiting to be written, and it was very joyous. And so I was able to, I think too, I didn't know where to be in the world, in the contemporary world. I just finished a doctorate and you just feel very sort of messed up and displaced. And so I wrote my way back into that world because it still had some sort of magic for me, and I needed to create.
We
Actually,
this
just
is around
before
about the time, actually. This is around about the time when you were writing it that we reconnected, so to speak. I think we'd last seen each other around about late 1980s.
Yes.
And you emailed out of the blue, and we started emailing, corresponding, and it was around about this time that you started writing this book. And if I may say so, there was such a happiness coming from you when you talked about writing this book. You just seemed so happy. It was wonderful to read. Just coming through the emails very strongly. And when I read the book, it's very funny, it's very comical. You've got a terrific sense of humor, but it's also shot through with sadness. There is a terrible tragic incident, which we might talk about, I'm not sure. But throughout, it just seems such a happy book. You were describing a really wonderful and magical place at a particular time in New Zealand. It's a very, very, very New Zealand book of an alternative lifestyle, which really gets seldom gets written about or portrayed. If it does, it's usually in sort of kitschy ways. Oh, look, hippies bathing naked, something like this. So this is a lot more complex than that. But am I right in thinking that while you were writing this book, it was a very happy experience, Miro?
Yes, it was. I mean, yeah, I'm so pleased you picked up on that, because it was just joyous. I just, I would wake up. I couldn't wait to get out of bed, and I'd often be at my desk at sort of 5:36. It would just be like, oh, yay, I can go there again. It was, and I think I write somewhere in the book that, when I'm writing, sometimes it's like making a garden to wander in, and it did. And I don't really even mean that in a romantic way, but just atmosphere and sort of a fertile space and somewhere to dream. And I was very friended by the process. I had all these people that I think that I'm happiest when I'm conjuring others. I sort of feel as if I become an actor then, and I can sort of pass out of myself into my version of whoever I'm writing. And it's a real transport. I can't tell you the excitement in trying to nail a character. And just the handling of the words, just the handling of the sentences, a lot of pleasure. Yeah. And also No, but I'm really glad you said that, because I think one or two reviewers kind of, in a sort of kind way, said, oh my God, she's survived, she's a survivor. And they sort of wrung their hands a bit. And I felt, oh, it's really not a misery memoir. I didn't feel like that. But as you say, there's plenty of sadness, but yeah. Well, and there's also tricky sexuality. And I'd been teaching for 10 years, and I'd been observing, I suppose, younger women, the women that were my age around the time of that book. And sometimes I just saw stuff going on that made me reflect, I guess, on what I was like at that age and the trouble, and I wanted to write about that.
And you write about it very frankly. I mean, you're talking about characters, and one of the leading characters in the book is yourself. It's a wonderful self-portrait of Miro at 14, 15, 16. And at one point you describe yourself as, in those years, and you describe yourself as, I was a young animal. And you talk about sexuality in a very candid way. You don't blame anybody. Certainly you're in a very vulnerable position. And I suppose in modern parlance, you were at the mercy of predators. Can you discuss that?
Yeah, it's sort of a big, complex subject. I think that Manaroa was actually curiously protected in that way. So I was very lucky that, again, Manaroa had its own sort of quiet ethical system, and there really was no predating, which was perhaps unusual in the hippie world. I'm not sure. It just, that was what I knew. It was probably too small, and the men were all sort of in their late 20s, and I was just unscathed, I guess, in that sense. Although right towards the end of my stay there, I did get involved with someone old enough, much too old for me, but more than that, probably much too bitter and scarred for me. I probably didn't even use that word predated in the book, because
you didn't.
I courted him pretty heavily, but I had some unpleasant brushes with just a kind of an uncomprehending male sexuality that didn't really have any sense that I was still partially a child. And I think that was kind of a flaw in that world. And I was talking about it with Charlotte too, that there was something around that time which was very permissive, and the concept of the sort of agency of the child or the child woman was perhaps over I can't think of the word, overconfident, you know, because it didn't take in, the power relation wasn't discussed, you know. And sometimes that sort of comical manifestations, and sometimes it was just too fluid, too fast, too soon. And I was a very young child woman amongst a lot of adults. So I'm not really talking about Manaroans, I'm talking about the extended world. And yeah, there was some unpleasant encounters, which strangely I seemed to move through. It's very hard talking generally. You know, there's specific incidents, and I do sort of unpack them in the book. Yeah. And sometimes people spoke out about them with me as well. So I can't speak generally about it, Steve. Yeah.
I guess I should ask about what I referred before about the kind of tragic core of the book. And this is something terrible which happened, and I remember hearing about it living in Wellington, and it was a story which frightened everybody who heard it. Many of us who heard the story in the Lotus Yoga Centre where I was living were familiar with one or two or three of the people. Basically, it was a couple who had got together, and the woman's ex-husband killed them in a very savage and lurid way, and then tried to mutilate himself. And it was a trial a couple of years later. And that's such a sad and tragic episode, and it casts a very dark shadow on this beautiful Arcadian community that you write about. Was it a lot for you to deal with?
Oh, it was a lot for all of us to deal with. Yeah, you know, it was ultra violent. It was very sudden. It was very incomprehensible. It took away two extraordinarily kind of gentle, pacifistic, funny, charismatic people. One of whom, John of Saratoga, I had been really quite in a sort of a rather lovely teen sort of crushy way, quite in love with for years. And he was just someone elusive and a very sort of broken down asthmatic that had this kind of beauty and resilience. And Jane was his new love. So it was a horrific crime. I mean, I write about it in the book. I write about it in the book. And people, you know, have sort of somebody else in the book sort of wrote to me after Slacker, and who had lived with John at Saratoga, and felt as if he'd been rekindled for her again. So I did have a really strong sense that I didn't want him to disappear, because it's interesting that you say, you know, that people were aware of it from Australia, trying to go back and find anything online. I just couldn't find any mention of it. And I felt, I felt as if he'd disappeared, him and Jane, from view.
Yeah, it was, I mean, no doubt it was written about in the newspapers, but it had a kind of another life, the story, as some kind of powerful myth, some sort of terrible warning. I should butt in here and apologize. I did not begin the session as I ought to have, and said to anyone who's watching this that they're open to, welcome to ask questions of Miro. Fortunately, several people have, and I should like to select from one of these questions to give to you, Miro, if I may.
Yeah. Well, would you like to do that rather than a reading, or we could maybe do the reading at the end? Or
I'm very glad you say that, Miro. You reminded me of another thing, your second reading. Could you perhaps give your second? Would you mind giving your second reading now? And right, at the conclusion of that, I will select a couple of questions. But yes, in the meantime, anyone who's watching this, please feel free to send through questions. Over to you, Miro.
Thank you. Okay, so this is also a big shout out to my father, who has very amiably said it's okay for me to read this bit. And he is hopefully listening there in Wellington, where he lives. And this is much later in the book. All I think I need to say to you is it does dip into, it's in the hippie world, but it dips back into when I live at my grandmother's, because the memoir moves around a lot in time. It's called I Had a Dream. My father enjoys the discussions of karma, past lives, soulmates, and other issues of spiritual evolution that pepper hippie discourse. Vague, speculative, and magic realist as they are, these ruminations and assertions are like good stories. Occasionally, I throw in the odd curly question about historical atrocities and genocide, to which I never receive a satisfactory answer. Otherwise, I keep my mind and ears open. But the concept of a behavioural balance sheet is familiar. I was introduced to something similar in Bible class at otherwise secular Kelvin normal primary school. Nothing in my atheist upbringing had prepared me for Canon Joblin's weekly visit, which appeared as abruptly as it was later removed from the syllabus. Playing up in his first afternoon class, I wrote a crudely illustrated note. What does Canon Joblin fire out of his cannon? My indignation at this imperious man and his doctrine was embodied in this not quite rhetorical question, passed hand to hand under the desks. And in an orgy of primary school wit, my classmates responded with jobbies, poo, and we. The cannon I had drawn resembled a penis aimed at 3 o'clock, and we had our bodily functions scrambled, but the note was a runaway success. That is, until Canon Joblin intercepted it. After that, a different kind of note accompanied me home. My grandmother responded to this report of bad behaviour by having me pen the homily, treat others as you would have them treat you, in fancy floral script. I did so with only a little bad grace because, in fact, I agreed with the principle and the method of her lesson. And when I was done, my grandmother pinned this felt tip equivalent of an embroidered sampler to our living room wall. My parents' belief that they won't be taking another turn on the karmic wheel of death and rebirth is more of a turn-off. Estranged, they share a sense of spiritual high status, too highly evolved to come back for another round of reincarnation, but only in relation to themselves, not each other. I quiz my father again. What do you mean you won't be coming back for another round on the wheel? Just for the pleasure of hearing him indict himself further. It's not the wheel that bothers me, the wheel being the grandly intricate karmic wheel of life and rebirth that, thanks to Tibetan Buddhism, enjoys currency in hippie conversation. No, it is the temerity of thinking you might be done with its revolutions. My sister and I know that our father is susceptible to auto-suggestion. His dreams fall under the same rubric. These range from, I had a dream I need to get more vitamin B, to, I had a dream you could murder your mother if you don't get your feelings about her sorted. This is addressed to me after an unhappy visit up the valley to the house where she lives with her lover Heinz. Why would you need to read about vitamin B intake? Why would you need to dream about vitamin B intake when you can read about it in one of those boring health books and probably just have? Matricide gives me more pause. Don't worry, we've all been murderers in past lives, my father sighs. That is his version of comfort. Intelligent as he is, valiantly unconventional, there are days when he clips the lunatic fringe. I decide that he must be talking about his own feelings, even if he doesn't realize it. And yet, something of his egalitarian attitude regarding our dark capabilities and culpabilities remains. It is a salutary thought that we might all make murderers, an insight that history tends to back up. That thought sneaks through the barrier of teenage skepticism and takes permanent root in my imagination, in my peripheral understanding of who we might be. Years later, when I'm at design school in Wellington, my father phones to continue the riff. I had a dream you could give birth to your reincarnated Uncle Martin. I hold the receiver of the phone closer to my ear. Martin? But he's dead. My father is unmoved. He has his oracle voice on. Reincarnated Martin. I think he might choose you to be reborn too. I realize there is gallantry at work here, and just for a flash, I do feel weirdly flattered. It seems to be a compliment that Martin might select me as future mother and birth canal. Perhaps this is another gesture of comfort. Martin is coming back. These delusions notwithstanding, I think the idea in pretty bad taste. Even so, I have a vision of Martin with self-cut pudding basin hair and Nehru collared shirt emerging fully formed feet first from a vagina. My vagina. No way. When I still lived with him, Martin cut the collars off his shirts and hand-stitched the edges closed, some with statement flowery bias binding, Nehru collars. His half-sister, my renegade mother, figured in his inspirations. Despite my grandmother's censure of her, he knew that my mother's sartorial daring stood for both itself and something else, another way of seeing. Martin was fashioning himself in subtle ways that spoke to his convictions. But now he is freshly dead by his own hand. And although I grieve him, I do not believe him coming back, not ever. Unable to banish the thought of his rebirth, I tell my mother, who is on a rare visit to Wellington for art business. She is sitting in the kitchen in my flatmate Faye's white vinyl hairdresser's chair, a salvaged item that still sports its heating hood. My mother's current art dealer sits across the table. I recount my father's vision because I don't know where else to put it. Reliably, my father escalates the imagery by adding a shoe shine brush. A creature of constant industry herself, this is just what she sees. Martin, mid-rebirth, shining his shoes. Nor does she forget his rhyming, shining button eyes. She loved her half-brother, is no stranger to the outlandish. We dissolve into hysterics. After that, I try not to think of my father's prediction ever again. That's that.
It's amazing how you went from comedy to tragedy there, talking about your Uncle Martin who took his own life. He is among the people, many people that you write about. Somebody is referred in their questions to quite a large cast, and that's true.
Yes.
One thing I found quite refreshing about it, Miro, is that one of many things, but one thing in particular that I zeroed in on is that you didn't seem to go along with this thing which is happening a lot these days of asking people their permission. to write about them. And indeed, you wrote this piece for a reading room after the book was published about hearing from a number of people who were written about or who knew some of the people in the book. We have a question saying, is there anyone that you identified and regretted it?
Not so far. In fact, I sort of had the opposite. There's a little sort of archive there, and it's not all popping up at once, but there is a character in the book. There were just a couple of names I changed. If I thought occasionally my sort of comedy bone ran away with itself, or sometimes I felt I was writing about someone that was a bit vulnerable because they were young. So then I changed their name, and there's only 4 or 5 in the book. But actually one, and I won't say who, but a man in the book. And I think it's a bit of a satiric portrait. He was very, very funny and very generous about quite a satiric portrait. And when VUP did a reprint, I actually went back to him and said, and would you prefer it if I just reinstated your and your partner's real names? And he wanted that. And Fergus and I did to sort of discuss it because au contraire, I worried about it a lot. I was a funny mixture of blitheness. On the one hand, I thought, no one's ever none of these people will read this book. It's so far away in time. And it's like they all read it and they all wrote to me, I feel. And I think there probably are a few that didn't write that are unhappy that I sort of heard.
But I think you discussed this with Fergus at the time, didn't you? I think this is Fergus Barrowman, the publisher at Victoria University Press, and I believe you say that Fergus's remark to you, which you remembered, was that most people would rather be written about than not. Do you think that's true?
Well, it has sort of played out like that. I don't particularly want to go there, but I think that's probably doesn't always work with close family members, and I think Charlotte experienced that too. But I think yes, I think on the whole, and people I thought were very generous in their response, and occasionally I got a correction, a few corrections, but mostly people even didn't mind the odd mistake. They'd say, oh, but the story's a bit better if it's my mother's wedding dress, or and they were unintentional mistakes. You said earlier that it's remarkably well remembered, but the thing really was that you sit down to write and then you just remember more and more. And of course it's a flawed medium, but it is extraordinary what you do remember once you start writing.
We just have time for one final question. Yeah. Somebody has written that after leaving Manaroa, you returned only once.
Yes.
And you quote, you end the book with a quote from Jonathan Richman, the musician, saying, I'm still in love with the modern world. Their question is, are you still in love with the modern world, or do you hanker for that primitive rural society you so beautifully evoke?
Yes, it's quite hard to be in love with the postmodern world at the moment in this particular phase that we're in. But I certainly do. I do just disappear into the present and its pleasures every day. But I also feel like everyone, I think, in the time of COVID, quite benighted by it at times. But I don't sort of kid myself that I'd be better off there in the book world. It's gone, so it's, but I guess I that as a writer, you do have that, you take that transport, and that's how you go back. That time is really fluid, and writing gives you that, and reading too. So I do like to disappear. I think that's why I'm a writer. I need to disappear, and that's how I do it. I need to go other places. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Miro, we've pretty much reached the end of the session. Thank you for coming along and speaking about it, about this wonderful book, which is really in many ways a love letter to Manaroa and those times and those people, and to the child that you were. It's not only wonderfully evocative, the thing I really sort of pushed me over the edge to name it the best book of nonfiction last year was the language and the beautiful sentences. It's so very well put together. It's just a splendid piece of art. Thank you to Kerry from Nelson for putting this together, and to our interpreters for their assistance on this. You've been wonderful. And thank you, everybody, for sending in your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more. Kerry, I'll leave it with you to wrap up, I guess. Over to Kerry.
Thanks very much, Steve. Really great conversation that you facilitated, so really appreciate you being involved. Thank you, Miro. And want to say thank you to Victoria University Press, who supported this session as well. And I wanted to mention, give the Australian publication of In the Time of the Manaroans a plug, Miro. I believe it's coming out through Ultimo Press in December. Yes. December in Australia. So if you're listening from Australia, you can go and buy a copy of the book very soon. Thanks for saying thanks to Fran and Kelly from Platform Interpreting. I want to also say a huge thank you to the Nelson Arts Festival team. Lydia, who's there in Auckland, providing backup support for Steve today. Annie, our marketing person, Wendy, Antony, and Tony, who are here in the studio with me, making this all happen. I want to say thank you to the Nelson City Council, who are the Arts Festival's core funder, and encourage you all to go out if you're in New Zealand and buy the book if you haven't already. And if you're in Whakatū, Nelson, please do that from Page and Blackmore, who is the festival sponsor. Last but not least, a little bit of a plug for our Writing Home project. This is an on-demand project. We launched, thanks, Steve. Yeah, good idea to hold up the book. We launched Writing Home last week, and we now have 3 of the videos up online on our website and also on the official Nelson Arts Festival YouTube page. And that's about it for today. So thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope you have a lovely Labour Day public holiday if you're here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Kia ora.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.